Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, What to Expect in 2025 for PBM Audits. Today, myself, Jesse Dresser, my colleague Harini Bupathi are going to be giving a rundown of some of the trends that we've seen over the past couple months and years, as well as some of the trends and what we can expect over the next year in terms of PBM audits and investigations. I'm a partner with the firm. I've been with the firm for almost 15 years now and dedicated most of my practice to representing folks within the drug supply chain, mainly pharmacies of different kinds. A lot of my work centers around the relationship between pharmacies and other stakeholders like PBMs, wholesalers, manufacturers, and others. A lot of it has been engaging in the good fight to try to level the playing field between pharmacies and PBMs who are occupy a very, very large and outsized role in the drug ecosystem and have a tremendous amount of leverage. And the fortunate thing, as we'll talk about today, is there are laws and other legal principles that pharmacies can leverage and utilize to try to balance that power a little bit. I'm joined by my colleague Harini Bupathi. Harini is another partner in the firm's life science department. I'll let Harini give a quick introduction about herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Harini. I work alongside Jesse. I've been at the firm for almost 8 years now, and I work with folks on different types of payer-related issues, all different types of providers. I also work with especially pharmacies and pharmacy-related types of transactions to assist them in issues throughout the transaction, such as due diligence, change of ownership requirements, licensing and credentialing, and all other areas of support. So we look forward to talking about the different ways that we can assist your pharmacy throughout this webinar.
So just a quick disclaimer, this webinar is for educational purposes only. Please note that this does not constitute legal advice and no attorney-client relationship has been formed. So with that, quick overview of Frier Levitt. We are a boutique healthcare law firm. We have a little over 50 attorneys, and we focus on representing healthcare stakeholders of all kinds, ranging from doctors, hospitals, surgery centers, pharmacies, drug manufacturers, and more. Our practice is dedicated to doing just about everything for these types of stakeholders, including dealing with issues like we'll talk about today involving payers, regulatory analysis, transactions, litigation, employment, tax, variety of other things. So we hope that we can be a one-stop shop for a variety of different healthcare provider types. So in terms of key takeaways today, as I mentioned, one of the things that we're going to start with is identifying the big PBM audit trends. We're going to learn how to recognize and address emerging audit patterns while you can implement safeguards to help protect your pharmacy, help protect and strengthen your pharmacy practices and try to balance shift the weight of balance against the PBMs to the extent that they are auditing your practice or continuing to expand their reach and abusive practices. We'll also prepare for 2025, anticipate some of the challenges that we think might emerge based on some of what we're seeing across the industry landscape in terms of the developments in the industry, in terms of some of the trends, where the industry is going now, but how we think that the PBM industry is going to react to all that and kind of what we're going to see from there. And then lastly, we'll go over some administrative and legal tools and frameworks that you can use to not only limit the risk, but also be able to stand up against some of these abusive practices. So in terms of flow, the way it'll work is I'm going to handle kind of the beginning part of this presentation. Harini will kind of bring it home with some of the tools and steps that pharmacies can take to limit their exposure and to push back. And then we'll both chime in on questions that come up. If you do have questions, there is a Q&A function. You can feel free to post them. If we have time, we will try to address some of those questions on this webinar. If not, I would ask that you include your email address, and we will make an effort to try to make some answers available to the folks that have questions along the way. So off the bat, audits and investigations. These are two commonly interchanged terms, although there are some differences between them. So PBMs use these terms differently to connote different things. There is a difference between them. Audits tend to involve a little bit more routine practices by PBMs, a little bit more routine kind of review of pharmacy claim submission, whereas investigations, there's a little bit more of a purpose. There's a little bit more of a reason behind it. So they both involve the review of claims submitted by pharmacies within a set period of time in an effort to identify potential issues of either contractual non-compliance, fraud, waste, or abuse, or other issues that could have resulted in overbilling, that could have resulted in billing for something that maybe wasn't otherwise covered, or could be evidence of fraud, waste, or abuse. Investigations tend to have a higher level of scrutiny in the process. Oftentimes, they require the pharmacy to respond to documentation requests in a much shorter time period. There's a little bit less leeway when it comes to extensions, less leeway when it comes to additional types of materials that the PBM will willingly accept when you submit to these types of investigations. Because again, it's done under the auspices of there being some kind of suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. Quick rule of thumb: audits tend to, in terms of scope, they're looking at the validity or cleanness of claims that have been submitted for reimbursement. Was your days supply accurate that you listed on the prescription when you submitted it at the time? Do you have a is your documentation in a row? Are there any things that maybe you put something at the point of sale and now they just want to validate? It's kind of the trust but verify approach, and wanting to make sure that they are taking steps to make sure that their pharmacies in the network are generally living up to the contractual terms, living up to good pharmacy practices, and billing for things that are appropriate. Investigations, on the other hand, while they do include some review of the validity or cleanness of claims that are submitted for reimbursement, they are also focused on pharmacies' general operations, their overall practices, and in many instances, their relationships with third parties, whether it's patients, whether it's prescribers, whether it's marketing firms, or others. Again, the idea and notion behind investigations is that they are meant to target a specific type of conduct, namely some form of fraud, waste, or abuse. The PBMs draw distinctions between these two different types of reviews because of, as Harini will talk about, a growing number of states have passed fair audit laws that require certain activities, certain steps, or certain rights to be afforded to pharmacies when they undergo audits by PBMs. Typically, those laws have a carve out for instances of either suspected fraud, waste, or abuse, possible fraud, waste, abuse, probable fraud, waste, or abuse. So the idea is that if a PBM is looking at some form of fraud, waste, or abuse, they can get out from the requirements that would otherwise be binding on them to give pharmacies rights, to give them the ability to more fully appeal or challenge PBM audit findings. They get to kind of escape some of those structures and go back to being a little bit more rigorous and some might say abusive when it comes to looking at pharmacy practices. So there are a couple different ways that these types of matters get triggered. PBM audits get triggered from a variety of ways. Typically, PBM audits, which were a little bit more commonplace a few years ago, they were routine. There would be every pharmacy would be audited once a year, maybe once every other year, and they could take a couple different forms. They could either be a in-person audit where an auditor actually shows up to the pharmacy, asks you to go get the binders, and flips through the pages while you're standing there. Or they could be a desk audit, which involves sending out a written request or a telephonic request for documents that the pharmacy then has to go and gather and send back. In the wake of, after COVID, in-person audits have diminished significantly for a variety of for obvious reasons. During COVID, obviously they stopped altogether, and since that time, there's been a lot more emphasis in kind of remote access and remote monitoring, and so there just hasn't been that same kind of return to in-person inspections that we've seen since before COVID. And in terms of the triggers, there's a variety of different things that can trigger an audit. One of the big things is the volume of drugs being billed. PBMs will oftentimes monitor the amount of high-cost medications that are filled by the pharmacies, and they will do an analysis comparing them to your peers. They will say you are in the 80th percentile when it comes to dispensing this type of medication. They will literally rank and show how many prescriptions of certain things that a pharmacy might have dispensed relative to another. They'll also look at trends of how much you have increased your volume over a period of time. Oftentimes, PBMs view a sharp increase of overall prescriptions being filled in a short period of time as being indicative that something might be wrong with those prescriptions. They'll also look at the volume of prescriptions that you're receiving from local prescribers relative to your overall number of prescriptions. So if you are receiving a lot of prescriptions from, let's say, a single provider's office, that might be reason for an audit. If you are receiving prescriptions from prescribers located all over the country and very, very few from your local area, that could be another reason for an audit. If you are receiving only a certain type of prescription, only certain specialty, that could be reason to initiate an audit. We've also seen audits stem from prescriptions, high volumes of prescriptions being filled for patients that are not in the local area of the pharmacy. Why is a pharmacy in Detroit filling a prescription for a number of patients located in Miami and other patients located in Dallas and Los Angeles and so on and so forth? So these are the type of analytical tools that PBMs have, where they automatically will flag certain pharmacies and say, okay, let's check in on these pharmacies because these flags are being kind of tripped. These metrics are occurring, and so let's take another look at this pharmacy.
And another audit trigger that I don't think is also contemplated here is the distance between patients and prescribers. So a lot of the times PBMs will also check to see where patients are residing in relation to their prescribers to understand how and if the patient's actually seeing the prescriber, whether there's been a valid patient-prescriber relationship established or not as well. So that's also another important audit trigger.
So like audits, there are also a number of triggers that occur for PBM investigations. Again, PBM investigations generally are focused on fraud, waste, or abuse, and they're usually triggered in addition to some of those metrics that we just talked about for audits. There are other things that can trigger it that are usually the receipt of information suggesting potential fraud, waste, or abuse. These could be complaints from patients or prescribers. PBMs maintain fraud hotlines that allow patients and prescribers to submit complaints or provide tips on suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. We've seen a number of investigations begin this way, where the PBM will point to having received a tip from a patient or a complaint from a patient or prescriber of suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. It's also possible, and we've seen it happen too, where the entity complaining is actually a competitor. If you have a competitor that is looking to go after the same business, and the competitor is unhappy that, let's say, you are routinely waiving copays for patients, they might say, hey, PBM, check out this pharmacy. They're routinely waiving copays. Why don't you do something about it? Because that competitor is losing business to you. So there are that risk too, that you could have competitors that are filing complaints against you. We also see investigations begin from referrals from regulatory agencies. These could be Medicare, it could be Medicaid agencies, it could be boards of pharmacy, it could be others that have provided a referral. Kind of the most common that we've seen are benefit integrity contractors. These are third parties that are hired by federal and state healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid, where they do reports and they do analysis of providers' activities and pharmacies' activities, and they'll issue reports. Sometimes what happens is, after a PBM conducts an audit and they make a finding, they might provide details of that audit and that finding to a benefits integrity contractor. For Medicare, it's called the MEDIC, which is literally stands for the Medicare Benefits Integrity Contractor. That MEDIC will then compile that information, maybe do a little bit of analysis of their own, and put together a report that they'll in turn share with the other PBMs. And so it's not uncommon for a pharmacy that's just been audited by one particular PBM and had findings to now in a very short period of time, also receive audit notices or investigation notices from other PBMs relative to very, very similar conduct. And usually that's stemming from having received a report from an entity like the Medic that says, hey, look into this pharmacy for this issue because they were found to have this issue occur with another PBM. Finally, like I mentioned before, we see internal analytics. This is where they have very sophisticated computer algorithms that will automatically flag pharmacies that have certain red flags, whether, as Harini mentioned, you have prescribers that are located too far from patients or too far from pharmacies, whether you have a very, very high increase in claims being billed in a short period of time, whether you have a high concentration of drugs in a particular for a particular manufacturer's product. The other thing we've seen tossed around a lot is this concept of a high cost, low value product and a focus around that. So those are the types of internal analytics that PBMs routinely run. And when they get to the point where they see something in those analytics that makes them think potential fraud, waste, or abuse, that's when they will typically initiate some kind of investigation. And the other thing I'll mention too is when investigations happen of other entities, whether it's a doctor's office, whether it is a prescriber or a patient, or even another pharmacy that maybe is somewhat affiliated with your pharmacy, that can equally spill over and lead to an investigation at your pharmacy if one of those other entities is undergoing its own investigation, and it suggests that there's some kind of relationship or affiliation.
And oftentimes, just to add on to that, oftentimes pharmacies aren't aware as to what the trigger might have been as well, whether it's an audit or an investigation. There could be an underlying reason as to why the audit or investigation might have been initiated, but oftentimes PBMs aren't the ones to disclose that. Perhaps in the course of an audit or a subsequent action by the PBM that might come to light. But initially, it's not something that the PBM comes out right and indicates to the pharmacy, hey, this is why you're being audited or investigated.
So in terms of different types of audit trends and areas of focus, one of the biggest that we're seeing in late 24 and into 2025, and I think we'll continue to see, is this concept of prior authorization. In order to get a drug approved, not only do you need a prescription and the drug needs to be on the PBM's formulary and the pharmacy needs to be contracted, but more and more, particularly with specialty drugs and other high-cost products, especially when there might be lower cost alternatives available, PBMs will require the drug to undergo a prior authorization process. They'll want to see that either certain clinical justifications are met in order to justify that drug. For example, that a patient has appropriate lab values that justify that drug, or has the appropriate conditions that make that drug appropriate. Other times they'll want to see that in a generic or alternative, lower cost alternative hasn't worked. That step therapy, that you've tried and failed alternatives, and that's why now you need to pay for this more expensive brand or more expensive specialty drug. There's a big question though on what the roles should be in this prior authorization process. Oftentimes it's the pharmacy, almost always it's the pharmacy that learns that a prior authorization is required, and it's the pharmacy that has kind of the direct knowledge of some of these requirements, but the pharmacy might not have all the information, and the PBM might also not want it from the pharmacy directly. They might want to hear from the prescriber or the patient to provide the information to indicate that prior authorization is appropriate. So in terms of some of the trends that we've seen a big focus of PBMs looking at the role of the pharmacy or the pharmacy staff in the prior authorization process. There are some PBM contracts that outright prohibit involvement by the pharmacy in the prior authorization process. And if it's believed or even suspected that the pharmacy has been involved in the prior authorization process or has submitted it, they will flag that as a basis for an audit or investigation and try to take back money. We've had instances where we fought pretty hard with a PBM to try to prove that the pharmacy did not in fact have a involvement in the prior authorization process. And PBMs can be somewhat incredulous that a pharmacy that a prescriber might actually be submitting prior authorizations that maybe they don't like, but the pharmacy had zero involvement in it. So we've seen a continued rise in not only the prevalence, but also the overall scope of these audits, focusing on whether the pharmacy was involved in the prior authorization process. Some PBMs will afford the pharmacy some ability to be involved, but instead of challenging them on whether or not they were involved, they will challenge them on whether or not they had appropriate authorization from the prescriber. They will, Express Scripts is one that has a provision in their contract that calls out how the pharmacy is supposed to get this authorization, and they will scrutinize that authorization as to whether or not it exists. So that's another area where we've seen intense focus in these types of prior authorization audits. There's also the concept of whether the information being submitted in the prior authorization process is accurate. Are the representations that are being made accurate? Did the patient actually try and fail those medications that are listed on that prior authorization form? And it's very easy for PBMs to audit this. They can develop algorithms that say, okay, if it was listed that the patient tried and failed the three following medications, and that's why this brand drug is authorized, they'll look at their DUR system and they'll see their dispensing system, and they'll see whether that patient ever received those three drugs. And if they don't see claims for those three drugs that have hit their system, they're going to presume that the prior authorization submission was inaccurate. That's not always the case. Obviously, there could be instances where a patient has been given a sample and it didn't work. There could be instances where the patient paid cash for a particular drug, or got it through another insurance, or got it through a discount card, and that's why maybe the PBM doesn't see evidence of that. So that's a big area of focus, is ensuring that the prior authorization submissions are totally accurate, that they're supported by medical records, and even better, that they're supported by time-stamped medical records that existed at the time, at or before the time that the prior authorization request was submitted. Because even in instances where we've had clients be able to go back, get documentation to show that evidence existed to support the grant of a prior authorization, if that didn't exist, if that hadn't been obtained and reviewed and incorporated at the time the prior authorization submission was made, we've seen PBMs say, well, you didn't, even if it did exist, the fact that you didn't check it is a problem, and so we're taking back the money associated with this. We've seen a big focus where prior authorizations are essentially Xeroxes of each other. PBMs that look for trends in the prior authorization submissions, that's obviously a big area of focus. So you want to make sure that if you have any involvement in the prior authorization process, not only are you making sure that it's on the right side of the law in terms of inducement or provision of things of value to prescribers, but also that it's in compliance with the PBM contracts. And then finally, that everything being submitted is accurate and is capable of being documented, that it's accurate, and supported that it's accurate.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think that any pharmacy that has any level of involvement in the prior authorization process should certainly have an outline of their policies and procedures, whether that's a formal policy or internal training of sorts, and we'll get into that. But I think that, especially with prior authorization, that if there's any level of involvement, that pharmacies clearly lay that out, what their process is in terms of trying to obtain a prior authorization for any patient.
So another area that we've seen historical focus and expect to see continued focus is on inventory and invoice reconciliations. This is where the PBM will ask the pharmacy to provide data on all their purchases, and then they'll compare those purchases against claims billed. And if you've billed 1,000 units, but you've only purchased 100, the PBM is going to be asking you, how could you have billed us for another 900 units when you have no record of having purchased it? In terms of previous trends, we've seen a big focus on refusing to credit pharmacies for purchases made prior to the audit period. So, for example, if the audit period ran from May 1st, 2023 to May 1st, 2024, and the pharmacy made a large purchase in March 2023, the PBM wouldn't necessarily consider those purchases. We've also seen historical trends involving refusal to consider purchases made from wholesalers that didn't meet the PBM's supposed terms and conditions for appropriate wholesalers. They were either non-NABP accredited wholesalers, or they were not authorized distributors of record for that particular manufacturer. And even though they were completely licensed, even though there's appropriate documentation in invoices and in inventory reconciliation reports provided and proof of payment, the PBMs wouldn't accept the purchases because they didn't come from one of these wholesalers that the PBMs had deemed to be appropriate. We've seen in terms of recent trends and trends into 2025, we do envision that this bulk purchase restriction, this is where if you're going to make purchases that are more than several months of product at a time, you have to disclose this to the PBMs. This really kind of eats at the competitive advantage that pharmacies can drive by making large purchases, taking advantage of quantities of economies of scale, taking advantage maybe year-end sales offers by different distributors that are looking to hit their numbers. If you don't provide notice of this to PBMs, there are certain PBMs like Caremark that have the right in their contracts to exclude those purchases from the calculation and not count them and uphold an audit. We've also seen a big focus on purchases being made through marketplaces. These are marketplaces that are designed to facilitate transactions between pharmacies and maybe not their primary or secondary wholesaler, may even facilitate transactions between pharmacies and other pharmacies looking to sell inventory. Again, great way to take advantage of market efficiencies and be able to drive a couple extra basis points when it comes to buying a little bit cheaper, which can be important. But we've seen PBMs want to require steps that are beyond what the Drug Quality and Security Act requires in terms of track and trace and in terms of some of these other documentation requirements that simply aren't necessarily capable of being met. And again, something that we envision is going to continue into 2025.
Another key area of audit focus are denials, whether that's patient denials or prescriber denials. With patient denials specifically, a lot of the denials that we're seeing are with respect to patients allegedly denying the request or the receipt of prescriptions, even though the pharmacy's gone through the process of authorizing or confirming the authorization of patients prior to the point of dispensing. And even though patients are signing for prescriptions or confirming that they receive them, at some point, PBMs are contacting patients and inquiring as to whether or not they received their prescriptions, whether or not they requested it, whether or not they paid copay. There's different ways that we've known PBMs to make this inquiry, whether it's through telephone calls or just through written questionnaires, and to ask them these very nuanced questions for prescriptions that were probably dispensed over a year ago and are heavily relying on really the patient's ability to remember what they did a year ago, let alone some folks can't remember what they did yesterday, but really stretching it to have them remember what they did a year ago. And so oftentimes in these questionnaires, we're seeing PBMs ask, did you pay your copay? If so, how much? What kind of copay? Or and what method of copay? We'll talk about different types of copay issues that we're seeing later on. Another question that we see in these questionnaires are how the patient received their medication, whether it's through delivery, through the in-person pickup at the pharmacy, and whether or not they even requested this medication. Was it something that just landed on their front steps, or is it something that the pharmacy had confirmed that they actually wanted to, in fact, that the patient in fact wanted their medication? And so before this continues. We're still seeing PBMs contact patients to confirm that they receive their medications, but we're also seeing that PBMs are calling to confirm that they did in fact sign for some of their prescriptions. Again, these prescriptions could be over a year old, and if there's the slightest discrepancy between one signature versus another, we're also seeing PBMs refuse to accept those signature logs, especially if they don't meet all the elements that are required by the PBM's provider manual. Something minor as not including the prescription number, even though you could clearly identify from the actual POS receipt or the signature log that it belonged to that specific patient and for that particular prescription number. A very just hyper technical reason to deny accepting a signature log. In addition, we're seeing a lot of issues where PBMs are refusing to accept signature logs that are just kind of scribble. But if you think about it, when you go pick up your prescription or you go sign for anything, you're usually just writing a quick scribble, and it's not your perfect John Hancock or anything. And so we're seeing a lot of the times, especially when pharmacies are submitting signature logs, things that have always been historically accepted through past audits, through anything else, with the PBMs, like regular claim reviews. But now we're seeing that PBMs are refusing to accept those signature logs if there's any sort of inability to identify who was actually signing for it. The other things that we're seeing PBMs take issue with are signature logs that have a difference of when the prescription was dispensed versus when it was picked up, especially if there's a large enough discrepancy. Obviously, we want to see that pharmacies are dispensing medications within 14 days of having submitted the claim and that patients are receiving them. And so that's also another reason that why PBMs are refusing to accept certain signature logs or certain documentation, and then allege a claim as discrepant, particularly if a medication isn't getting picked up or isn't getting delivered to the patient within a certain period of time. The other thing that we're seeing, especially with patient denials, are documentation issues when trying to combat those patient denials. For example, if you receive a patient denial in the course of an audit, the PBM saying, hey, we contacted the patient denied receiving or requesting this medication, we may want some additional confirmation from the patient, such as an attestation. What we're seeing is a straightforward attestation where a patient might just say, hey, yes, I did in fact receive my medication. Yes, I did in fact request my medication, where that would have otherwise been sufficient in the past. We're kind of seeing it. PBMs take it one step further, where they're wanting to see the patient expressly recant their previous denial to the PBM. So that's another additional area that should also be considered to be included in attestations going forward, and also any sort of outreach to patients. Obviously, there's a lot of he said, she said, but in order to sort of set the record straight with PBMs, there's definitely an importance of making sure any sort of documentation to combat a patient denial is very thorough. Includes documentation prior to the point of dispensing, where you confirmed that you received the authorization from the patient. And then also when you did receive the alleged denial, that you're also clarifying why that denial might have occurred. Perhaps the patient misunderstood the questionnaire that was being received. Perhaps it was just an issue of failing to recollect something, again, that might have happened a year ago. Whatever the reason, we're seeing that PBMs are requiring pharmacies to clarify with patients why they might have previously denied those prescriptions. And of course, it's very concerning that patients are being asked to remember, all these prescriptions that happened a year ago, but that's where your documentation definitely comes in place to be able to remind patients sort of, what they might have received from the pharmacy in the past, and any interactions that they might have had with the pharmacy. And that goes on to the copay collection issues that we're seeing a lot of PBMs also audit pharmacies on. PBMs continue to review pharmacies for their copay collection policies and practices. Some PBMs even require that pharmacies provide a copy of their copay policy at the time of an audit. So it's really important to always maintain a written copy of the pharmacy's copay collection policies, and even more important that they're being adhered to, especially if you're providing a copy of that policy to a PBM. It becomes an additional policy or terms and conditions that the PBM can measure you up against, in addition to their own terms and conditions. And PBMs continue to question the validity of the documentation, particularly for copay collections that are being submitted, and continue to require receipts that confirm patients did in fact pay their copay, whether that's in cash, credit card, or check. And that for each form of payment that the pharmacy maintains proper documentation. For example, cash copays in particular, PBMs may want to see that in addition to a POS receipt, that the pharmacy is making an actual deposit of cash into the pharmacy's bank account, at least on a regular basis. We've seen a PBM go so far as to require that a pharmacy actually maintain a log of cash copays to correspond with each bank deposit. Obviously, a very extreme step and very tedious, especially if you think about the day-to-day operations of a pharmacy, to have to now identify every single time it received a cash copay to then match up with this every single time it's made an actual deposit into its bank account. We've also seen, as it relates to credit card receipts, that PBMs require merchant reports. Again, we've seen that happen in the past, but we're also seeing that for those merchant reports that they clearly identify each transaction to then line up with each prescription, and that the amount paid to the pharmacy via the credit card matches up with the amount for that particular prescription. And of course, that doesn't take into effect or into factor that there might have been other prescriptions that the patient might have paid for, or they might have also purchased something else at the pharmacy. So again, that's where documentation comes into hand. It's really important for the pharmacy to maintain proper POS register receipts that clearly account for everything that's being paid for by the patient at the point of sale. And lately, what we're seeing is that PBMs have become more strict with the documentation requirements to confirm copay collection, and that they require almost every single element, such as the payment method, prescription number, last four digits of credit card, the exact copay amount, everything that you might otherwise see in the documentation guidelines in your provider manual to be included. And for any reason that if it's not included, then we're really seeing them, again, super hyper-technical reasons to try to deny the documentation to demonstrate copay collection. And in the event that pharmacies don't collect copays, PBMs also require that pharmacies demonstrate good faith collection efforts that actually result in copays being paid the majority of the time. So for example, if the PBM is auditing the pharmacy for about 40 claims or 40 claims, and for all of those claims, there was a copay that was required, and the pharmacy had only collected copays twice or two times out of the 40 times, even though the pharmacy had demonstrated that it engaged in good faith collection efforts. It was calling patients, it was sending out invoices to collect copays from patients. PBMs have suggested that's not otherwise sufficient to demonstrate good faith efforts because the pharmacy wasn't demonstrating that it wasn't collecting copays the majority of the time, and that those good faith efforts weren't actually being done in good faith. Again, that's where the policy comes into place. It's really important that a pharmacy has a copay collection policy in place and that it's following it to a T, especially if pharmacies have a financial hardship policy, and to the extent that they do, and that's the reason that if a patient indicates that they can't afford their copay, it's really important that a pharmacy follow its financial hardship policy. Certain PBMs actually outline specific requirements as to what the policy should entail, including an analysis of financial hardship, communication that should be going out to the patients on a regular basis regarding their eligibility for financial hardship, and documentation requirements that the pharmacy should be maintaining to confirm financial hardship as well. So especially in the areas of copay collection and financial hardship, we're really seeing an uptick in these types of auditing practices. Certain PBMs that might not have ever asked for copay collection confirmation in the past or documentation are now asking for it as part of the regular audit. And so it's really important that the pharmacy demonstrates copay collection prior to the initiation of an audit or an investigation. That's another point that we're also seeing, is that if the pharmacy, even though it's engaging in its regular course of trying to get copays from patients, gets a copay paid after an audit or investigation was initiated, we're seeing that PBMs aren't accepting that documentation because they're suggesting that it was done in reaction to the PBM initiating the audit or the investigation, and that the pharmacy wouldn't have otherwise collected on it. So again, if you're able to demonstrate that it was done in the normal course of business, in the normal course of the pharmacy's practices, that's really important. And so I can't stress this enough. I think especially copay practices for pharmacies are very key to make sure that they're following them and that they actually have a policy and procedure in place. Another key area that we're seeing is in relation to mailing or the method of how pharmacies are delivering their medications to patients. Ever since the expiration of the public health emergency for COVID back in 23 and the waivers to mailing that came with them, some of them expired in May of 23, some of them expired in December of 23. We've been seeing that PBMs have been auditing pharmacies to ensure that they're servicing patients in a manner consistent with the terms and conditions of the provider manual. For example, if a PBM doesn't allow mailing, the PBM might include this as part of their audit requests, request that the pharmacy confirm the method of delivery to the patient, whether that's delivery or whether that's mailing, and that the pharmacy provide documentation to confirm it, such as a signature log or or tracking information. And a lot of the times there's a big confusion between what really constitutes delivery, what constitutes mailing, and that could be very PBM specific. Obviously, it's important to look at your PBM terms and conditions to understand what the difference is there. But almost a general rule of thumb is that deliveries usually is the delivery of medications through an actual employee of the pharmacy, generally a W-2 employee of the pharmacy, whereas mailing is through a common carrier, whether that's UPS, USPS, FedEx, or even a third-party carrier. Sometimes some folks say, hey, we have a local carrier, they'll do the deliveries for us. Does that count as mailing? Essentially, yes, that we're seeing anyone that isn't considered a W-2 employee is usually kind of bucketed into the common carrier category for PBMs. And so there's a real distinction that PBMs identify between delivery and mailing. And then with that also comes the distance from the pharmacy. Oftentimes, if patients are residing at a distance greater than 50 to 100 miles from the pharmacy, PBMs are almost like running these algorithms, or that we're seeing run these algorithms to identify or to assume really whether or not the pharmacy is engaging in mailing practices or delivery practices. And so when identifying the distinction between delivery and mailing, the distance of which patients reside is also another factor. And PBMs might even question the validity of a signature log for a patient that resides at a distance greater than, say, 50 miles from the pharmacy, because PBMs are wondering, hey, is the pharmacy really delivering these medications to the patient who lives 60 miles away from the pharmacy by hand, or are they just mailing it to them and making up the signature log? And so we're seeing a lot of that happen. We're seeing that a lot with the PBMs, and we're also seeing that with specific plans as well. So we're seeing those types of audits come through. And if in fact that the pharmacy has been identified to mail in a manner inconsistent with the terms, so if the pharmacy wasn't allowed to mail, but they were mailing, say in 24, when the waiver had expired in 23, we're seeing PBMs charge back pharmacies for those claims. We're also seeing PBMs try to terminate or send cease and desist letters over to those pharmacies as well. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're trying to identify how to service your patients and the method of servicing them, that it's being done, again, in a manner consistent with the terms and conditions of PBMs. Moving on to third-party relationships is another key area of focus that we've seen in 24, and we do anticipate to go into 25. Typically, PBMs limit pharmacies from being able to submit test claims. Test claims are generally defined as claims being submitted without a valid prescription on file, usually for the purposes of determining reimbursement and coverage. And not only do PBMs limit pharmacies from submitting test claims, PBMs generally don't allow a third party to submit those claims on the pharmacy's behalf. Of course, if the pharmacy can't, why should a third party be allowed to? But then also, PBMs prevent pharmacies from giving out their credentials, such as their MPI, without permission from the PBM, for example, in the instance of any sort of hub relationships. And recently, what we've been seeing is a lot of pharmacies have been faced with audits where the PBM is suggesting that there were a number of test claims, sometimes even hundreds of them being submitted. And oftentimes the pharmacies weren't even aware of that occurring because they had entered into agreements with these third parties that gave them the ability to process claims on their behalf without the pharmacy not even realizing that was happening or that it was even a violation of PBM terms. So pharmacies who enter into enter agreements with third parties for things such as like prescription streamlining or any sort of other like software type of benefits. They should certainly ensure that these third parties aren't receiving their credentials or receiving the pharmacy's credentials for the purposes of using them to submit test claims to identify, something as like benefits verification or coverage. Again, just to make sure that they're not submitting them for test claims, because that's been a big thing that PBMs have been looking for. And so similarly, PBMs have and always this has been, I'd say, something that's been happening for a couple of years now, but there's certainly been an increase, is the review of pharmacy marketing practices. Whether that's through an investigative questionnaire or through the course of an audit, what we're seeing are PBMs asking whether the pharmacy has any third-party marketing arrangements, really what the method of obtaining new prescriptions and patients are, and whether or not, if they have any sort of marketing arrangements, whether or not they're consistent with the provider manual or agreement, making sure that there's no type of solicitation of patients happening that are then pushing patients over to the pharmacy. So that's certainly something to keep in mind, that before you enter into any sort of arrangement with a third party, particularly one that hasn't been disclosed to a PBM, that you're making sure that that agreement, while it might be compliant with, the law or applicable law, that it's also compliant with your requirements as a provider in the PBM's networks. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And the reason that we do these types of webinars are really to make sure that pharmacies have the tools and understanding as to why appealing audits are really important, because they could lead into adverse actions. There's a host of reasons as to why, which, include recovery of funds, terminations, actions by other PBMs, et cetera. And so in order to prevent those types of actions, we really like to engage in these types of webinars and to help pharmacies kind of make sure that they're always being proactive rather than reactive. That's something that I personally always like to say. It always helps to be proactive, which is why when we talk about policies and procedures in the course of the pharmacy's, day-to-day operations, it helps to be proactive and identify the measures that the pharmacy should be following to make sure that there aren't any sort of audit issues or any sort of non-compliance issues that can sort of come up at a later point. And so, again, some of the reasons why appealing audits and terminations are so important include the possible recovery of money for claims, particularly for claims for medications you've already dispensed to the patient. So now, not only are you out the reimbursement for that claim, you're also out the cost of the medication that you purchased then dispense. You could also see a lot of cross-termination issues for pharmacies that you might have an affiliation or ownership with. In fact, I've seen an instance of where, say, a father owns a pharmacy and that got terminated by a specific PBM. Daughter, a couple years later, goes out to go get another job at a pharmacy that's trying to get credentialed into the same PBM, gets denied because of the familial relationship with the father and the pharmacy that was previously terminated. Another thing is that we're seeing that by not challenging audit results, they really do impact your relationship with third parties. For example, Board of Pharmacies, oftentimes it's not surprising for a PBM to report findings to boards of pharmacies. A lot of those findings, especially in audit results, are certainly contractual, but sometimes you'll find some issues that could be considered a violation of the Board of Pharmacy rules and regs. And so that could lead into a complaint, could lead into disciplinary action, which then may become reportable to your other payers as well. So while one PBM may have initiated an action, it could certainly kind of create a domino effect that you'd certainly want to avoid. The other thing is that there's certainly the reality that a lot of PBMs do get it wrong. Whether that's audit discrepancies or trying to terminate the pharmacy, there's certain instances of where you'd want to make sure that you go ahead and address them. Not only do you want to be out money for the claims that they're alleging as discrepant, you'd obviously want to maintain a pharmacy in good standing. And so there's the reality of wanting to make sure you kind of set the record straight as to why you're a pharmacy in good standing and have a clean record, and why the PBM might just be wrong. And so that's certainly something that you'd want to consider, even regardless of the dollar amount. And that's because sometimes PBMs compound audit results that have occurred over the past couple of years. We've seen instances of where a pharmacy could be notified of being terminated, and you'd think it'd be like the most recent audit that the pharmacy might have faced. No, sometimes the PBM's also alleging audits that might have happened, 9 years ago even. So they're compounding audit results or poor audit results as a reason to show that the pharmacies have been engaged in a pattern or practice of bad behavior, and that otherwise might justify termination of the pharmacy. And so to prepare for audits, there's a couple of key things that we try to suggest for pharmacies, and just a practicality of just really being organized and ensuring your pharmacy staff is being trained on the pharmacy's policies and procedures. That's really important. Our firm puts out a checklist almost every year, and it's updated. It's updated twice a year, actually, on key audit issues that we're seeing. It's essentially an audit checklist for folks that are preparing for an audit, that have gone through an audit, or again, just want to be proactive in their pharmacy's operations, just to follow along to make sure that their practices are kind of consistent with what we're seeing in the industry or with PBMs, particularly in audits or any sort of adverse actions. And so documentation is really important. You'd want to make sure that, for example, for all your purchases, that you have all your purchase histories, especially given the limitation of pharmacy wholesalers to only go back so far. You'd want to make sure that you're maintaining your own records, your own invoices, your own proof of payment, as well as any communications that you might have had with prescribers, with patients, really anybody that you're keeping them for a period of couple of years. The other thing is to really review your own practices to identify any sort of areas or triggers that PBMs might identify and that might lead into an audit. For example, high dollar claims, specialty medications, GLP-1s even, are frequent targets in audits. And so you'd want to pay extra attention to those types of prescriptions and those types of, and any documentation related to those prescriptions in your records. You want to conduct internal audits on a regular basis. One of the easiest things that we see pharmacies do is conduct their own inventory reconciliations, and it's something that can be done on a regular basis, on a semi-annual basis, just to proactively identify if there's been any discrepancies. And to the extent that there are, if there are any discrepancies or oversights, that's really where you'd want to be. You'd want to make sure that there's additional policies and procedures that are being implemented. For example, in a corrective action plan, we have seen PBMs require corrective action plans if there's been oversight or discrepancies. And so whether that's an internal corrective action plan or one that you have to submit at a later point or at the point of a request to a PBM, CAPs do really serve as some sort of an assurance to the PBM, but also to yourself as well, to make sure that any sort of oversight, if it did in fact occur, would not occur on a going forward basis. They often do reflect favorably on a pharmacy, and oftentimes, like I said, PBMs do ask for CAPs to be implemented. But again, if in the point of your own internal audit outside of an audit that's initiated or an investigation initiated by a PBM, it's really important to make sure that the pharmacy implements its own CAP as well. And to that end, the training of staff is very important. While you might have policies and procedures, for example, we talked about prior authorization policies, copay policies, whatever it might be, while you might have written policies and procedures, it's very important that the pharmacy is actually following them. Oftentimes we'll see pharmacies have these boilerplate type of policies and procedures, and while it's fine to have a third-party group prepare those for you, you should really make sure that it's tailored specific to your practices, that you're identifying people that are in charge of making sure those policies are being reviewed on a regular basis. For example, having an annual refresher on policies and procedures and any sort of CAPs for your staff to be up to date on a regular basis. At the beginning of the year, it helps to review your provider manuals and your agreements to see if there's been any new terms that the pharmacy then needs to start complying with. There's not enough emphasis, I think, on policies and procedures and really making sure that your staff is thoroughly aware and fully trained on them. So that's certainly something that pharmacies should consider as they go into this year. In addition to the administrative tools that PBMs allow for you to challenge an audit, whether that's through their appeals process or a further appeal process or a grievance process, pharmacies also have legal tools available to them. That includes the dispute resolution process that most provider manuals or provider agreements provide for pharmacies as a further next step of challenging audit results or adverse actions. You also have prompt pay laws, which require PBMs to remit payment on clean claims within a statutory period. So in the instances where you're undergoing audits or investigations or subject to chargebacks, that's really important to keep in mind. You also have any willing provider laws that allow the pharmacy protections in the event of a PBM trying to seek termination against the pharmacy. You also have state any willing provider laws as well. And again, another layer of protection. And to that, you also have pharmacy fair audit laws. Again, Jesse mentioned this earlier, there's a carve out for a lot of these pharmacy fair audit laws when it comes to investigations, but it's still important to keep in mind that when you receive an audit, to make sure it's being conducted in a manner consistent with fair audit laws. You'd be surprised as to how many times they're not being, so it really helps to make sure that you're aware of your state's fair audit laws, especially if you experience a number of audits or just, again, to be proactive. And so I realize that we don't have a lot of time here, and we can address a couple of questions that might have come through. But if anyone has any questions following this webinar, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Our contact information is right here, so feel free to shoot us an email for, again, any questions that you guys might have throughout this process. Just have a couple of questions that came through. We'll see if we can address them. Okay, so someone asked what they can do if the PBM said that their audit results are final. Again, we talked about this earlier. There's a lot of administrative processes that the PBM allows for. Even though the actual audit results might say final, you may have a further appeals process. For example, some PBMs allow for a pharmacy audit review committee that reviews final results one more time. Sometimes they'll take another look at what the auditor might have come to the conclusion of and any additional documentation that you have to submit, and then provide another revised final findings or the ultimate decision on final findings. You also can leverage the dispute resolution process that I mentioned earlier as well through counsel. That's why it's really important to have effective counsel, especially through the dispute resolution process, because that allows you to continue being able to have that conversation with the PBM over your audit results, and also try to prevent any sort of further action against the pharmacy. Oftentimes folks say, well, the audit results said final, so I didn't do anything else. And sometimes that could lead to the PBM suggesting that the pharmacy accepts those audit results and hasn't taken any efforts to try to resolve them, and essentially agreeing that the PBM was correct. And so it's really important to be to continue that conversation with the PBM. Realizing that it's already at 1:30. Like I said, if anyone has any questions, I see a couple here. We'll try to get back to you guys via email, but otherwise, feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.